welcome back. So this just turned into Defending Jacob Season 2, Defending Henry, and I have to say when I saw this ending I was a little bit disappointed because I didn't see it coming. So the episode starts off with Henry and it ends with Henry for good reason, right? So we are post-interview, the aftermath, and it seems like the media, the police, everybody wants it to be Jonathon. And the narrative here is that people like Jonathon get away with murder because they're rich and entitled. And this is just kind of another dude getting away with shit that he shouldn't be getting away with. And there's a lot of pre-trial nerves, right? And this is the first time I think we've seen Jonathon genuinely nervous. And his kind of carefully constructed mask is coming apart, right? So we start off and we see that Jonathon is already nervous, right? Like he's kind of yelling at Grace saying, why are you following her? Why are you doing this and that? And this kind of nervousness like trickles out throughout the episode, but most notably in this meeting with Haley, right? So we are finally at the trial. We are finally, again, there's two questions here. First, did he do it? And second, will he be found guilty? And it's looking like I don't see how he can get out of this, to be honest. And so we get to this meeting between Haley, Grace, and Jonathon is like, what is your strategy? Like, what is it that you want? And even his lawyer has no faith in him, right? Like her strategy is literally, we're just gonna try and wing it kind of and go with the flow because yeah, you're not an ideal client. And she kind of breaks it down, right? Like she has the jury selection down to a science. She has these professional women. She has this guy who's currently cheating. Like she's really done her best in terms of like the best that money can buy. And they're doing everything like really shady shit, like putting pro-defense news feeds into their search engines and things like this, like really like borderline illegal stuff. But despite all of Haley's efforts, the one thing that kind of keeps coming up over and over again is like, if he didn't do it, then who did? Like she needs alternatives, and she doesn't really have a lot of alternatives, right? So the only thing that she can do, and what she's kind of trying to explain to Jonathon and Grace, is that you have to look like a couple. Like you have to look like two people who are in love because they have to see you as a human being, right? Like maybe you're a scumbag, but you're not a killer. And that's pretty much my plan, right? Is he human? Does she love him? Is there anything redeemable about this man? Because a lot of Haley's strategy just seems to be like, we need to basically kind of get this narrative that everybody's coming in with out of people's heads. And again, this is a lot easier said than done. So we finally get to this trial, day one. And again, Haley has an uphill battle, right? The prosecution comes out, and the only thing that's kind of saving Jonathon is the fact that they don't have the murder weapon. But they pretty much have everything else on their side. So the prosecution opens up and it's pretty convincing, and then Haley comes in. And right off the bat, she has to kind of present an alternative. Like she has to create muck, right? And the only person that she can kind of present is Fernando. And this is both good and bad, and this could actually be Jonathon's downfall, because her logic to try and save Jonathon's life is that he actually loved her, and because he loved her, he just isn't capable of killing anybody. But who is capable of killing someone is her husband. And the idea is that, like, looking at Jonathon, does he really seem like an angry guy? But when you look at Fernando, like her husband, he had all the motive, he had all the opportunity. More importantly, he had the kind of anger to commit this crime. And this strategy of Fernando is really dangerous. And it's actually a strategy that we later find out that Jonathon just is totally against. And again, there's no communication between the lawyer, Grace, and Jonathon. Like, it seems like Haley's kind of like doing her own thing without really consulting them. But I think the biggest problem with Haley's defense, as we kind of see as the trial goes on, is the fact that the media really sympathizes with the husband. Technically, it's a good start on paper, but again, like, they're kind of having to fight the media, and they have it's an uphill battle, right? On paper, everything Haley is doing is great. But again, there's a lot of sympathy for Fernando, right? Like, it was his son that found Elena dead. And also, it's just in bad taste, right? Like, it's just not something that people want to hear. And even if they can kind of see where Haley's coming from, it's not really a point you want to see, right? Like, especially when you pit this working class man against this really rich doctor who's been having an affair with, However, with that being said, a large part of Haley's strategy is to try and make Jonathon into a human being by having Grace and Jonathon kind of at least look like they're together. And this sort of strategy, I think, enables Jonathon to weasel his way back in, right? Like, so after the trial, they're all staying in separate homes, they're all staying in separate houses. And Jonathon is a sneaky guy, right? Like, he's very smooth, he's a smooth criminal. And he calls her up like they're old friends. And he's like, well, I'm bored, I just tried to call you. And again, he's kind of taking advantage of this window of opportunity that he has. And at first, Grace is not really having it. But Jonathon, again, he like brings up the past. He's like, well, remember when we used to talk on the phone and you never used to hang up on me and this and that. And again, he's a very manipulative dude, right? And I don't think he really understands losing. And later we find out he doesn't really know what it means to suffer, right? But all this to say, she not only hangs up on him, she resists for a bit. She then goes over. Not only does she sleep beside him, but then she ends up sleeping with him, which for me really suggests that Grace, as her father said in the last episode, is someone who chases ghosts. And I don't think she's going to give up her husband quite easily, right? So she comes home, she does kind of the walk of shame, and Henry's waiting for her. And Henry's an interesting kid because before the trial, Franklin kind of makes the point of saying, like, please, Grace, stop acting like any of this is for your son's best interest, because it's not. So Henry has been devouring the news. He's been watching everything. He's been kind of reading everything. And nobody's really been paying enough attention to him, right? Like, and he's waiting up for her and he's wondering where she is. And she kind of comes back home and he's like, where have you been? Like, I have, you know, like he has so much anxiety. He wanted to sleep in her bed. And essentially Henry confesses to her, right? He kind of drops a major bombshell. He says, I saw them together. So one day, Henry, according to Henry, he was going to school and he looked back and he saw Elena and Jonathon kind of having a conversation, but their body language and the way they were talking for him kind of indicated like this was more than just a friendly acquaintance. And in his word, he saw that I saw, he knew that I knew. And the reason that he didn't tell Grace is because he trusted him, right? Like, and this is established from that first episode, which is increasingly becoming more important. Like, they're best friends. It seems like Henry and Jonathon are like two peas in a pod. He really respects him. He'll really do anything for him. And he has so much guilt, right? Like, he's telling Grace, like, I'm so sorry I didn't tell you this. I'm so sorry, this and that. And what I got out of Henry's confession is really interesting, especially coming off the last episode, because it seems like both Henry and Grace grew up with these images of their families being perfect and these marriages being perfect, right? So Grace kind of grew up thinking that her father and mother had this perfect relationship and that he loved her, when in fact, by his own admission, he was a cheater, right? Like, he wasn't that great of a guy. And the only reason he treated her well was to kind of enable him to cheat some more. And Henry's kind of having the same experience, but at a younger age, right? Like, as far as he was concerned, Grace and Jonathon were perfect. Like, he had the perfect mother and father. Like, and this is established in the first episode, right? Like, they all seem in unison. Like, they seem like the perfect family. But Henry's world is kind of shattered, right? Like, his world is totally disturbed when he sees this. And how did he react? Like, how, like, you know, this must have been earth-shattering, especially if he had this idea of them being perfect. And Grace is, you know, she's looking at him and she's trying to calm him down, but this is such a major bombshell, and she kind of takes this information and she throws it in Jonathon's face, right? We're at day 2 of this trial, and this is like rocky waters, right? Because again, this entire trial rests on making Jonathon a human being. And again, he keeps lying, right? Like, everybody's covering for him, but we're not really sure why. And not only that, maybe Jonathon is covering for Henry, right? So she kind of yells at him and she's like, why are you always lying? How come you didn't, you let our son see this crap, you let this and that. And it's just, Jonathon doesn't have anything to say, right? He's kind of standing there like, it is what it is. Like, I did what I did. And Haley, poor Haley, right? Like, I feel sorry for this lawyer. Like, she really deserves everything that she's getting paid, because she's about to interrogate the police officer that's kind of leading this investigation. And, Grace is in tears. Jonathon just seems indifferent. Like, he just seems like a cold robot. And so this kind of unraveling of what things look like and what things really are, it just starts to accelerate, right? We are at day 2 of this trial, and Haley is basically interrogating the police officer, Edgar Ramirez. And she really goes in on him, right? Because at this point, she has to present an alternative. And the only way to do that is to throw everybody under the bus. And the police, it's really interesting because we get a lot of information here. First, that there was 2 sperm samples that were found at the scene of the crime. One was Fernando's and one was Jonathon's. But we're not really sure the time of day, right? Like, we're not really sure when she had sex with either her husband or with Jonathon. So this is her first kind of point. And her second point is, how come you never made anybody else a suspect, right? Like, how come you never really investigated the fact that Elena clearly had some psychiatric issues, that she was quite possibly seeing other men? Like, why did you have tunnel vision for this client? And the biggest kind of bombshell she drops is the fact that Fernando's alibi is his 10-year-old son, right, who was asleep. Like, there's just nothing there. Like, it's a very weak alibi. But Edgar Ramirez holds strong, right? He's like, well, there's nothing showing them on the camera. There's nothing this and that. Like, you're kind of creating things that don't exist. But again, that's not Haley's point. And I think she did a very good job of kind of showing how the police just didn't really have any other suspects, right? Because they didn't read anybody else their rights. They didn't really chase after anybody else as hard as they chased after Jonathon. And this is a little suspect, right? And it does some good, right? Like, you can see her kind of chipping away at the jury and kind of chipping away at the prosecution. But I don't know, like, you guys let me know. But I thought Haley did a very good job of really kind of throwing him under the bus. But again, like, if you watch the police officer's testimony, like, he's unusually passionate about Fernando. Like, I don't know, maybe he's just like that type of guy. But I thought it was really interesting that he really kind of came to Fernando's defense. And it seemed there's something personal about it. And I'm not really sure if I'm just reading into that too much, like, you guys let me know. But when I found out about the alibi and the sperm, I'm not gonna lie, like, it did look a little suspect that the police didn't really look into him, especially considering that they don't have the murder weapon. But anyways, like, again, she's doing her best, but it's an uphill battle. Despite the ups and downs, this was a very successful day too. And we get to this family dinner between Jonathon, Grace, and Henry. And Henry is very optimistic, right? And just the contrast between his optimism and Grace and Jonathon just sitting there, they're kind of deadpanned. They're not feeling the momentum. At the end of the day, people have a lot of sympathy for Fernando. So the strategy of throwing the screaming father under the bus, although practical on paper, again, it just seems like it's in bad taste, right? So they're looking kind of grim. And Henry's really kind of adamant here. He's like, he even kind of goes in on his mom saying, if we survive this trial, we can survive as a family. And again, Henry has a very specific idea of his parents. They think that this is the perfect relationship. He thinks that, you know, like, if this is not perfect, then what is? And Henry's still not really understanding that this affair that he had was a little more than an affair, right? And he kind of makes the comment of saying, like, we should get a dog, like, really create this picture perfect life. And everything Henry's saying is superficial, right? Like, there's no depth to it. He just wants things to go back to the way they were. But the problem is, the things, like, nothing is what you thought it was anyway. So there's nothing really to go back to. But while they're kind of having this conversation, we find out a lot about Jonathon, right? So if you remember in the first episode, Henry wanted a dog. And Grace basically said the reason that we can't have an animal in this house because Jonathon, when he was growing up, had a pet. And his family kind of blamed him for their dog's death because it was hit by a car or something like this. They were talking about it like very early on in the first episode. And we find out that actually this was not a pet, but Jonathon's sister. So it seems like when Jonathon was a teenager, he was tasked with babysitting his younger sister. And he was a little bit kind of absent-minded and he was making a sandwich. And during this time, his little sister kind of ran out onto the street and was hit by a car. And this kind of was devastating for him. And this is the reason why he just, I guess, didn't want a dog. And in his words, he didn't kill the family dog, he killed the family daughter, right? And this was such a bombshell because first, how did he keep that hidden for so long? And what I got out of that story is the fact that Grace really doesn't know anything about Jonathon, right? Like, she takes him at his word. But this just came as a shock to her. And now she's finally doing more investigating, right? Like, she contacts Jonathon's family to try and figure out, like, what exactly is going on with this man. Because up until this point, she's assumed that it was this incident with the dog that kind of caused this rift between Jonathon and his family, which is also a little intense to think about. But all Grace knows is that Jonathon isn't very close with his family. And as far as from his perspective, it's because his family cut him off, right? But as we find out later, you know, appearances can be deceiving. At first, you really sympathize with Jonathon because you're like, oh my God, like, this is the reason he became a doctor. Like, he felt so guilty. Like, maybe he is a good person. But again, like, there's two questions, right? Like, does something like this make you more psychotic, or does it make you more compassionate? We get to day 3 of this trial, and Fernando's on the stand, and Haley kind of rips into him, right? Like, and this was probably the best part of this whole episode, because you really kind of see the desperation in everybody, right? Like, Fernando's tired. He's just sick and tired, right? And here Haley is basically gaslighting him. She's like, well, I don't want to incite your rage. I don't want to do this and that. And she's trying to paint this alternative kind of picture, right? She's trying to say, okay, your wife had an affair that you didn't know about. She was on medication. And apparently Fernando might be on medication as well. Like, trying to really paint a picture of this very unstable human being that's capable of murder, whereas her client is a very stable man who, although had an affair, isn't this guy who's able to lose control as easily as Fernando. But it seems like, watching Fernando's testimony, especially when you look at the contrast between Fernando and Jonathon, it's very stark, right? Because at least Fernando has emotions and he's able to kind of feel things, whereas Jonathon is just like this, right? And you find out why that is later on. So we get to the end of this trial, at least for this episode, and again, I'm not sure how well Haley's strategy is working, especially when you see them kind of side by side, because you really want to sympathize with Fernando, and honestly, you do kind of want to throw Jonathon in jail just to throw him in jail. But up until this point, like, Grace hasn't really been doing a lot of investigating on Jonathon. Like, she's been kind of all these efforts, everybody covering for Jonathon has been focused on everybody around him, right? Like, investigating Elena, investigating Fernando, but nobody has bothered to investigate Jonathon, right? Because he just, to be honest, like, watching Fernando's testimony, I was wondering, why is it that we've never looked into Jonathon? Like, he kind of says things like, honestly, quote unquote, like, I had an affair, I loved her, and you take his word for it, but there's nothing beneath the surface, right? And we kind of find out why, because it seems like Jonathon is somebody who's never experienced suffering. So Grace calls Jonathon's family, a family that I guess she's not close to, a family that just they have no connection with. Jonathon's mother finally calls her back, and she basically explains what happened with Jonathon. So essentially, this sort of incident happened with Jonathon's sister, and according to the mother, who seems like a bit of a sociopath herself, they kind of offered Jonathon all the support. They were waiting for, the grief and guilt to show up. They were ready to help him through it, but it never came. It seems like after Jonathon's sister had died, he kind of cut off his whole family. Like, he just kind of cut everybody off, and he left, and he never talked to them again. And in essence, it seems like his own mother thinks that her son is a sociopath, and her exact words is he felt neither grief nor guilt. And this is so eye-opening, because he really just doesn't seem like somebody who cares, right? Like, anytime he talks about Elena, it's always in reference to himself. Like, I was such a nice guy, I was such a victim of her, and she kind of took all her crazy anger out on me. Like, he's always the person who, like, things are happening to, but he's never the person who's ever done anything. So this incident with his sister is, first of all, something that he clearly feels guilty about, but does not want any type of responsibility for. The thing is with Jonathon, like, he says a lot of stuff and you kind of take him at his word, but again, there's nothing beneath the surface. So while Grace is kind of finding out all this information, like, he's having his meeting with Haley, because I guess the finale will be his testimony, because he has to kind of explain why it is he ran. And his logic, like, he's literally looking at pictures of her saying, I loved her, I really, like, appreciated her. And when you listen to Jonathon talk about Elena, it's so personal, right? Like, I loved her, but there's always this, like, but at the end, like, but look at what she did to me. She kind of pushed me to this point. Like, there's always something, like, at the end of his sentences that suggests that he's just not a guy that likes to hear the word no. So Grace gets this information and she's kind of shocked, right? Like, she's kind of looking at everybody differently and she doesn't really know what to think. And she kind of feels a little bit ridiculous for never having initiated calling his family or really kind of looking into him properly. But we get to the end of the episode and this is where the bombshell drops. So she's going into Henry's room after the trial, after she kind of found out all this information. And there's a moment where she's kind of looking at Henry like she's unsure, right? Like, do I know you? Like, are you a sociopath? Like, am I seeing things? Because clearly I'm not really sure about anything. And she's cleaning his room and she sees his violin on the floor and she kind of like tries to put it back in his case. And in the violin case, she finds the murder weapon, right? And not only does she find the murder weapon, Henry's awake, he kind of sees her find it, right? And they're looking at each other like totally horrified. And that's how the episode ends. So overall, I thought this was a great episode. I thought, again, you guys let me know what you think. Like, I don't, whether or not Henry killed her, I'm not sure, but he definitely was involved, or he definitely was in the room when it happened. And it might explain why Jonathon is kind of covering, right? Like, he says in that interview at the end, like, I have an idea of who did it. And, like, I'm a little angry at myself for not seeing it coming with Henry, because especially when you consider the fact that Henry and Grace have a lot of parallels in terms of seeing their parents or seeing the people in their lives as being the perfect embodiment of what it means to be married or what it means to love, and kind of having their world shattered before their eyes. And so the question that I've been asking is, like, how does Jonathon react when things don't go his way or his mask kind of falls apart? But to be honest, how did Henry react when he realized, like, things are not what they seem, right? So you guys let me know what you thought of that ending. I was a little bit deflated, I'm not gonna lie, for various reasons. But yeah, you guys let me know what happened, because at this point we have an idea of the people that were involved. We just don't know, like, the order of events or the sequence of events. And so yeah, like, overall a great episode. And I will see you, I guess, at the finale. So take care.